Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Michaela Habersky, and I work here at the Jefferson Educational Society as the Marketing and Events Assistant. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, and I'm here to do 3 quick things, I promise. First, I want to go over some housekeeping notes. Then I want to tell you about some upcoming JES events. And finally, I get to introduce tonight's speaker. First, the housekeeping. If you need assistance during this event, please find myself or one of our wonderful volunteers, and we would be happy to help you. Right. Some quick notes on the Q&A portion at the conclusion of the lecture. Please raise your hand to be called on and speak into the microphone that we will bring you. Also, please keep your questions brief and concise and refrain from offering lengthy statements. Now, moving on to upcoming events. Tomorrow at 7 p.m., Dr. Jay Koss will take the stage again at the Jefferson to resume his week-long residency about the founding of America with the Founding in Perspective, Thomas Jefferson. Lastly, I would like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Jay Koss is a Gerald R. Ford non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, columnist for National Review, and contributor to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He's the author of several books, including A Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of American Political Corruption. Please join me in giving a warm JES welcome to Dr. Jay Koss.
Thanks. All right. Hi, everybody. It's good to see you all again. We're now in lecture number 3 of the series. We're talking about Alexander Hamilton. I think that this will be an interesting lecture. And just so you know, too, that now that we're moving into Hamilton today, Jefferson tomorrow, and Madison Thursday, this is really more my area of research. So I hope it will be harder for you to stump me during the Q&A. I was sweating it a couple times. Ferky had a tough question about George Washington, and I was like, I don't know. But so it should be tricky. So here, of course, is Alexander Hamilton, as we all know. I'm calling him the mysterious Colonel Hamilton. And so just as a sort of just an interesting historical tidbit, I think, is that he was often referred to as a colonel. He was promoted to colonel at the formal end of the American Revolutionary War, and it was a title that he kept for his life, and his friends and his enemies called him a colonel. So I often just sort of instinctively, and I realized when I put these slides together and I was looking them over, I realized I had done that without even thinking it. So the mysterious Colonel Hamilton. I think it goes without saying that no founding father is more dramatized than Hamilton. But, you know, what's interesting about Hamilton is that if you go back 60 years in time, people would be talking about Thomas Jefferson just like they're talking about Jefferson today. But 60 years ago, not so about Hamilton. Hamilton was really kind of read out of the history of the American founding until relatively recently. And it was really, I think that his real emergence is in the last generation with the publication of Ron Chernow's biography in 2004. That was the source material for this musical. But the question that I want to ask to start is, who are we really studying when we look at Hamilton? Is it Hamilton, or is it some version of him that we've created? And I think that that's not a criticism of the musical. And just to be clear, I haven't seen the musical because, honestly, I'm too close to the material. I'd probably get annoyed at the way they presented James Madison, so I never actually watched the music. That's not a criticism of the musical. I remember years ago, I was on a panel sponsored by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette about the musical, and I was with some historians who were like, well, it's not very historically accurate. I don't have a problem with that. I remember when I started teaching high school 7 years ago, I had a freshman student come in and she could sing the song of George Washington's farewell address because of the Hamilton musical. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't really care because it was getting kids to learn about civics through sneaky means, but I applaud that. But Hamilton, I want to suggest to you that in a lot of respects, no founder seemed more ancient than Hamilton. And by that, I mean in a classical sense, that just he's an individual possessed of passions and interests and virtues that come across, I think, to me at least, as very foreign. And it leads to strange motivations that move his political career. So consider some of these more bizarre choices that he made. He counted himself at the Constitutional Convention unfriendly to Republican government. His plan of government was Republican sort of in name only. We'll talk more about that. That's very peculiar, I think. He speculated in private, mind you. He speculated in private that if the Constitution were to fail, maybe we could bring over one of George III's children to rule as king. And if you know your history of Hanoverian England, George III's male sons were for the most part rotten to the core. George III and William, they were terrible. He leaked information to the British foreign minister during delegate negotiations with respect to the Jay Treaty. John Jay was going to go over to Great Britain, and one of his instructions was, if the British give you a hard time, we want you to touch base with the Russians and the Dutch and the Germans about joining a League of Armed Neutrality. And Hamilton assured the British Foreign Secretary or the British attaché in New York that that was never going to happen. He admitted publicly to an affair with Maria Reynolds, which itself was extraordinary because this was at the height of his public career and also the height of his divisiveness. He had an affair with Maria Reynolds, who was a married woman, and Maria and her husband turned around and began to blackmail him while he was Secretary of Treasury. And Hamilton admitted to the affair in public in a written letter that was printed to the public as a way to sort of like insist that his public character was above board, that he may have had a failing in his private life, but he did not abuse his office. Just an extraordinary thing. He speculated about invading Virginia to suppress the Jeffersonians during the Quasi-War. He wrote a 30,000-word essay denouncing John Adams's character. I mentioned that yesterday. As you can imagine, Adams was pretty spicy about Hamilton for the rest of Adams's life. And the most remarkable thing, too, is he died in a duel with Aaron Burr because he would neither admit nor deny that he criticized Burr. And the letters, you can find the letters at the National Archives. They're extraordinary to read in light of the fact that this was going to end his life. 47 years old. My age, basically. He was my age. And he had young children as well. It's just extraordinary that he would allow this to happen. Whatever archetype that Hamilton was an example of, it was not modern. It was something else. So as we look at the real Hamilton, we have to be careful, I think. And we have to be mindful that he's not going to... And look, I think this is something his biographers suggest, too. They look at Hamilton's plan of government offered at the Constitutional Convention and say, well, he probably didn't mean that. Well, I think he did. And that's okay. I mean, it's okay. It was a different era. And there's lots to learn from a Hamilton. But when we try to look at the real Hamilton, there he is, we have to be careful. So let me just quickly, because I didn't, this is called vamping here. And get my, there we go. So Hamilton's career was breathlessly quick. The kids would call it a speed run, right? Like in a video game. Shockingly fast. And to put this in comparison, George Washington and John Adams were born in the 1730s. Jefferson was born in 1743, Madison in 1751, and Alexander Hamilton was born in 1758, which would have made him about 23 years old when he became a delegate to the Continental Congress. He won a scholarship to attend King's College. He was born on the Caribbean island of Nevis, and he won a scholarship. And he promptly got himself involved in revolutionary politics. He became aide-de-camp to George Washington. And he married Eliza Schuyler, who was the daughter of a prominent New York patrician and General Philip Schuyler, who was a friend of Washington's, Philip Schuyler would go on to be a senator from New York in the first Congress. He was a delegate to the Continental Congress, and I should make clear when I say the Continental Congress, I don't mean the 1776 version. What I mean is that Second Continental Congress is in continuous session until 1787. Hamilton comes in, I think, in 1781. He attends the Annapolis Convention with James Madison, which is where a call for a general constitutional convention is issued. Hamilton is actually the one who writes that, the report of the Annapolis Convention. He participates also in the Constitutional Convention. Interestingly and surprisingly, he's not much of a factor at the Constitutional Convention. There's a couple reasons for this. One is that New York politics is dominated by the governor of New York, George Clinton, who is an opponent of a stronger central government. So there's 3 delegates who are sent to New York, Hamilton from the pro-Federalist side, and then 2 Clinton allies. And so Hamilton gets voted down on everything. And then finally, the 2 Clinton allies just leave, and so Hamilton can't really vote on anything because there's not a quorum for the New York delegation. And Hamilton himself leaves for periods of time as well. But even then, when Hamilton gives speeches, his views tend to be outside of the mainstream, as we'll see. He did, however, write most of the Federalist Papers. The overwhelming majority, in fact, I think he writes about 50 of them. Madison writes about 25 or so, and then John Jay writes 5. And of course, he becomes the first Secretary of the Treasury, and then during the Adams administration, he becomes the senior officer of the Army. So it's just a very, very, very fast professional development. Now, Hamilton had, as I'll suggest here on the next slide, what I'm calling a manic brilliance, just an absolute manic brilliance. He is able, as a writer and as an intellectual, able to synthesize just a diverse array of information into coherent wholes. He's also a very, very able polemicist. And actually, it's really interesting to read the Federalist Papers. It's pretty easy to differentiate the ones written by Madison and the ones written by Hamilton. Madison is very nerdy. He writes sort of like a college professor. Hamilton is almost like jousting. It's a very like slashing kind of prose that's very aggressive and really enjoyable to read. I would point out also that he defeats Jefferson and Madison in most political battles in the 1790s. And it's Hamilton who successfully manages to drive a wedge between George Washington on the one hand and Madison and Jefferson on the other hand. That's Hamilton, which is really impressive because James Madison did not usually lose political battles himself. He, in his own respects, was a brilliant political operator, but at multiple points in the 1790s, Hamilton outmaneuvers him. This is a quote from Thomas Jefferson, and I think anytime you see a political opponent praise it's really a sign of something. This is Jefferson writing a letter. Hamilton is really a colossus to the anti-Republican Party, which is what Jefferson's term for the Federalists were. Without numbers, he is a host within himself. And actually, it's funny because in the debates on the Jay Treaty, which I had referenced last night, and also talked about this afternoon, Hamilton was a big supporter of the Jay Treaty, and he wrote something like 80 essays in support of the Jay Treaty. It was just an astonishing number. And Jefferson is begging Madison, pick up your pen and cut down his heresies, Jefferson writes to him, and Madison wouldn't do it. It was just too much. He couldn't keep up with Hamilton, just couldn't keep up with him, which is really saying something because Madison himself was capable of such an extraordinary amount of effort. And yet he is capable of such profound blunders as we've seen here. And so what I want to suggest here is that when we think about Hamilton, we need to think about him as being ancient and modern simultaneously. And just by the way, the mere fact that he's on the money is extraordinary, right? Think of how many non-presidents are on the currency. By my sort of like thinking about it, the only one that I could think of besides Hamilton is Ben Franklin. And Ben Franklin was like the first international American celebrity, right? His economic vision for the United States of America, which he begins to lay out in 1790 and 91 into 92, is bracing. It is prescient. It is 50 years ahead of its time. It becomes the cornerstone in so many respects of America's approach to economic development until the Great Depression. That's what Hamilton was able to do. It's really remarkable. And ultimately, and again, another sort of sign of the way to pay your opponents to get a compliment, is that it's ultimately Madison who, as president, ends up implementing much of Hamilton's program, which 25 years earlier he had opposed. That is really saying something as well. And they had learned, Madison, and not so much Jefferson, he was more stubborn, but he had learned the hard way. Madison had opposed the Bank of the United States, for instance, which we're going to talk about. Madison had opposed the Bank of the United States when it was enacted in 1791. In 1811, it comes up for a recharter, and the Republicans in Congress choose not to recharter it. And so the country goes into the War of 1812 without the bank, and it is a disaster. Albert Gallatin is borrowing money sometimes over at 10% interest. It's so bad that the government has to suspend the repayment of notes in gold. That's how bad it was. So the absence of the bank was a hard, harsh demonstration that Hamilton had been right. But if his economics are brilliant, his politics are ancient, they are not the politics of modern America. As a matter of fact, when we begin to dig into his political theory, we're going to look at things that if people are doing that, we would say, oh, that's corruption. Like Hamilton is pro-corruption in many respects. And he's looking back to old practices. And he is unable to grasp the real political power of popular sovereignty and even the inevitability of popular sovereignty. That what was happening in America was increasingly a democratic revolution that was going to change the very nature of government itself. Jefferson is the one who understands that, not Hamilton. This is a quotation. I give you a sense of things from a dinner, this is from Jefferson's Recollections. The recollection is from 1815, but the dinner would be 1789 before all of the vitriol. So the background of this quotation is that Washington, I believe, was out of town, and he instructed the officials in the cabinet to, make an arrangement about some minor policy question. So Adams is there, and Hamilton is there at Jefferson's apartment in New York. So this is what Jefferson writes. After the cloth was removed and our question agreed and dismissed, conversation began on other matters and by some circumstance was led to the British Constitution, on which Mr. Adams observed, purge that Constitution of its corruption and give to its popular branch equality of representation, and it would be the most perfect Constitution ever devised by the wit of man. Now, if you were with us last night, that sounds very much like John Adams. That was exactly sort of his argument. Hamilton responds, purge it of its corruption and give to its popular branch equality of representation, and it would become an impracticable government. As it stands at present, with all its supposed defects, it is the most perfect government which ever existed. That is a very, very bold statement. And it's so bold that historians have often doubted, to some extent, whether or not Jefferson is actually being truthful. Except that when you look at Madison's records from the Constitutional Convention, he's pretty much saying exactly the same thing, that this is Hamilton's view, that the British system as it actually was, remember, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, and we talked about this certainly on Monday, that the Americans believed that the British system, while in theory was a good system of government, in practice it had become corrupt. And in that corruption, it had come to abuse the rights of the American colonists, thus justifying the revolution. And here's Alexander Hamilton making the argument that no, the corruption is part of what makes it so effective, which is a remarkable, remarkable thing. This, by the way, is not the only place where Jefferson recollects that, and I think it's just manifestly true that this is. I will say this about the quotation because it is from 1811, so you never know. But if it is apocryphal, which it might be, it might be a stylized reminiscence, it's not substantively incorrect. Hamilton's financial system, and this is where we get into some of the underlying ambiguities of Alexander Hamilton. because he does not have faith in democratic institutions. And yet, at the same time, he has an enormous amount of faith in the spirit, the character, the intrepidness of the American people. One of the most famous essays in the Federalist Papers is Madison's Federalist 10, which is this very nerdy, high-level examination of factions in a large republic. But if you turn the page to Federalist 11, you see this Hamiltonian hymn to the greatness of the American people, and that all the American people need is a government that is strong enough to unleash their talents. And Hamilton famously says that if given enough time, the Americans will themselves form one great American system that will baffle the combinations of Europe. I mean, it's just such great Hamiltonian rhetoric, right? Independent of foreign affairs, blessed with bountiful natural resources, and the American people having the spirit that they have, they would surely strive to greatness. All they need is a government to facilitate that. And here we see Hamilton at his most far-sighted because, of course, that is the truth. And remarkably, I think it remains the truth. You know, it's really interesting to go back. When I was a kid in the 1980s, you know, pop culture was very worried about the Japanese, right? The Japanese are Japanese companies, and the Japanese they bought Pebble Beach, and they're going to overtake America. And you look at the Japanese economy, and it's been pretty stagnant. And meanwhile, America, once again, is in this new AI revolution. Who's at the forefront of the AI revolution? America. And who would have predicted that above and beyond anybody else? Hamilton would have. Right? So this leads to Hamilton's great intuitions about the relationship between government, commerce, and industry. And the government has a positive role to play in the development of both of these. Right? Hamilton is, more than anybody else that we're going to talk about this week, he is most interested in economics. And his vision of government is mostly about driving prosperity. His admiration of the British system is actually a real advantage in some respects. It's certainly a political handicap, but Madison hated the British system. Madison hated the British in general. Jefferson had no regard for the British system whatsoever. They were willing to dismiss the entire thing as just corrupt and useless. But Hamilton, because he did not carry those sorts of prejudices, was able to see within it certain qualities and certain things that the British had done, that Hamilton understood. For instance, that how had the British gone from in 1500 being a backwater European nation behind the Spanish and behind the French, to by 1800 or 1700 becoming the pinnacle European power. One of the ways they did that was through the development of their financial system. It was Hamilton, not Jefferson and not Madison, who understood that. And it was Hamilton who, in many respects, was insistent on bringing that to life in the United States of America. And so in defense, when Hamilton defends corruption, Hamilton would say something to the effect of, you can call it whatever, I don't care what you call it. You can call it corruption. I'm just speaking about men and human beings as they actually are. And Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention says it is foolish for us to think that public motivations can be founded on pure patriotism alone. We have to take men as they are. And they require something more than patriotism and dispassion to succeed. Somehow you have to entangle and appropriate their interests for their own sake, right? Interested men who sought in government satisfaction for their own passions and interests. You had to make government a winning proposition for these people. That was how you built an effective and energetic government. Now, to be clear, and I want to be really clear about this too, because even Jefferson says this, in his personal life, Hamilton was honest. He's talking about what we would say corruption, but there is no evidence that he ever did anything inappropriate, and there were all sorts of accusations thrown at him. In 1793, the Jeffersonians in Congress with Madison along tried to basically get him impeached, arguing that he had misappropriated money. Pretty much the only thing that happened out of that inquiry was that they demonstrated they didn't understand the high level that Hamilton was actually working at. So Hamilton is not somebody who's looking to get rich out of politics. What he's saying is that natural aristocrats, the naturally great statesmen, have to use those people. They want to, satisfy their passions and their interests, and we have to somehow take their selfish interests and yoke it to the purposes of government. That was Hamilton's idea, right? And for Hamilton in the 1780s and 1790s, when we're talking about practical, like who are we talking about? What group of people? We are talking about the owners of the public debt. That's who we're talking about. Hamilton's relationship with what we could call the public creditors. All right. This is a very, very touchy subject in the 1780s. The United States, as I'm sure you know, had gone heavily into debt during the war. Heavily into debt. And the reality was that it was always probably going to have to do that, because the fact of the matter is that there wasn't enough cash in the United States that could be extracted through taxation. And so that really just leaves you run a debt, you put it on your credit card, or you do inflation. And the United States did both. So coming out of the war, there's I don't know, like $15 million of federal debt and another $30 million or so of state debt. Okay. Now, this money, not the money, the debt itself is owned by two sets of interests. There's the foreign holders of the debt. So like the Dutch, they buy a lot of American debt. But then there's also domestic holders of the debt, okay? And the thing to bear in mind about this is before the era of the stock market, okay? So if you're looking to make an investment, one place you would go as, one source of investment would be government debt, okay? There was money to be made for these men from the debts. And what happens in practice, and this ends up becoming a very, very controversial point, is that a lot of Revolutionary War soldiers were paid in government debt. And by the way, for how generous I think we are now to the American veterans, we were extraordinarily stingy to the Revolutionary War veterans. We paid them in government debt, okay? The problem is that the national government did not have any power to tax, and so there was no realistic hope that it was ever going to be able to pay this debt back. And so they give you $100 government bond. In practice would be worth as little as $15, right, in today's dollars. So what a lot of these veterans or widows did was they sold them because, they needed food. They needed cash for their farms, right? Because they were farmers and they needed cash for supplies for their farms. So they sold them. And increasingly what happens by the end of the 1780s, most of this debt is held by financial interests in the three eastern cities, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Now, that's where most of the debt is. These guys are buying it up at pennies on the dollar, sort of as kind of a hedge fund type of thing, all right? And by the way, so Hamilton's plan he's got a plan for these guys. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But the point, though, is that the British had done something like this as well. In the early 1700s, the British had figured out a way to manage their debt at relatively low cost. This, by the way, is a big reason the British are able to win most of the conflicts with the French between 1690 and 1815. There's a number of reasons, but a big reason is that the British figure out how to keep the interest on their debt nice and low. So Hamilton wants to do something with that, right? So what he does, and one of the things you're going to notice here, I want you to appreciate I want you to think about this. First, we're going to talk about it from an economic standpoint, and then we're going to talk about it from a political standpoint. Economically, everything that he suggests doing makes absolute sense. So what's he suggest? When he becomes Secretary of Treasury in January 1790, he issues a report basically saying, we're going to pay this debt at full face value, okay? We're going to pay our debts. Some people had suggested making the creditors take a haircut, like a modest haircut. Hamilton says, no, we're paying it all back. This ends up being a boon to the owners of the debt, which had, like I said, had been trading at less than 50 cents on the dollar, and some forms of government debt even lower than that. He also proposes assuming the debts of the states. In other words, it's not just federal debt that's the public debt, it's also the debts of Virginia and of Connecticut and South Carolina. All 13 states had contracted debts as well, okay? Now, there's an economic argument for this, which is most of this debt had been accumulated in the war, so it was a national effort, so we, the national government, should pay this back. But also Hamilton is thinking about the glue to hold this new country together, right? If you are an owner of, let's say, Connecticut debt, you are going to have an economic interest in making sure that the Connecticut government succeeds because they're going to pay you back. But if the federal government takes that debt and then suddenly you become an owner of U.S. debt, your interests shift. Now you have an interest in making sure that the new national government succeeds. See, this is the sort of thing that Hamilton is thinking about here, right? He's really, in so many respects, working at a completely different level than everybody else. He also proposes the creation of a national bank. Now, the thing to bear in mind about a national bank is at this point, I'm pretty sure there's only 2 banks in the entire United States of America. This would be the third. There was one in Philadelphia, the Bank of North America, and then I think there's one in New York, and Hamilton's proposing a third. It's going to be chartered by the federal government, but privately owned. All right, that's the next step in his economic system. And then the advantage of the bank is it would hold federal tax revenue. It would lend the government money, but otherwise it would behave as a normal bank, right? And so if you look at the Hamilton's first report on public credit, basically what he's trying to do in that is explain to the American people fractional reserve lending, right? It's basically what he's saying. If you have $100 in cash that's just sitting under your mattress, it's as good as useless. But if you put it in a bank and the bank can loan the money out while only keeping a portion of it in reserve, you increase the supply of capital in the United States of America. This is, look, this is common sense to us, but if you look at Americans in the 1780s and 1790s, there was real paranoia about banks. And I think most people don't understand how banks work. I frankly didn't fully understand it until I started researching this stuff. Right? Finally, Hamilton calls for financial incentives to stimulate domestic industry. So it's not protective tariffs, but it's something similar to protective tariffs. Okay. So when we talk about the benefits of this, right? This is his plan. There is a real genius. And I am not a fan of, on balance, I find Hamilton a very difficult person because there's so many things about him that I think are absurd and so many things that I think are sneaky that I don't like. But this is just mind-bogglingly brilliant. It's immediate benefits to the United States of America. The first thing is that if the government promises to repay the debts at full face value, then all of those government certificates that were trading at 50 cents on a dollar are now going to trade $1 on $1, which means that they all effectively doubled in value. So Hamilton, simply by saying we will pay the debts back, has increased the national wealth by probably $15 million, right? Which is a lot of money then. Also, it creates a de facto national currency. Now, what's the logic here? So bear in mind nowadays when we think about a national currency, we all have greenbacks in our wallet and that's our currency. Well, that's not how things worked in the 18th century. There was no national currency at that point. There were a variety of state currencies, and everything is trading at various discounts across the country. Same with government debt. So you could maybe, if you had a government bond, it might be worth 57 cents in Maryland, but if you go down to Georgia, it would be worth 43 cents. Everything is trading at a discount. And these discounts are completely indecipherable, and so there's effectively no national currency. And if there's no national currency, there's really no national economy. So what Hamilton says is that if we promise to pay all of our debts back at full face value, then a $100 bond is going to be worth $100 in Maryland or Georgia or in Rhode Island or New York, everywhere in between. And so suddenly the bonds can be used as a form of currency, right? Which is a precondition to economic development, really. And the bank was a massive liquidity injection into the economy because investors believed that it had the implied backing of the United States government. There was a huge scramble for bank stock, but moreover, the bank is going to be a private bank engaging in private lending, but it's going to be holding American tax dollars. So basically what Hamilton is doing is he is using public revenue to stimulate the provision of private credit. So all of this has the effect of basically jump-starting the American economy, right? And again, bear in mind that there is basically no banking in the country. Hamilton's system creates the framework for modern finance. It's Hamilton. That's why he's on the $10 bill. And it's this system that you can't have the Industrial Revolution without this system. You can't have the Industrial Revolution unless there's a stable currency. You can't have the Industrial Revolution unless there's reliable access to credit. This is why Great Britain was the first country to embrace the Industrial Revolution, because they did this in the early 1700s. And it's why America becomes the second country with the Industrial Revolution, because we did it in the late 1700s. And that, in so many respects, is due to Hamilton's farsightedness and his ability to borrow from the British system without being prejudiced by it, but also revise it and alter it so that it fits the American context. So what are the problems with it? That's James Madison. Madison was opposed to all of this from the start to the bottom. Hamilton's system was brilliant, but it provoked a heated response from James Madison almost right away. Its benefits, and this is the problem with it, its benefits are mal-distributed. Think about Hamilton's argument here is that in the long term, everybody's going to be better off. Okay, who in the short term is better off if the government promises to pay back its federal debts? The bondholders. Who's going to be better off if they promise to pay back the state debts? The bondholders. Who's going to be better off from the bank? Well, again, the bondholders, because you could use government bonds to buy bank stock. So who's winning from all of this? The bondholders. That's Hamilton's point, by the way. This is not something he's embarrassed about. This is the point. But the bondholders are the wealthiest people in the country, and they are a very narrow segment of the population. So what this is, in many respects, is it is a way of rewarding and enriching those who are already wealthy. And by the way, it's also a way of enriching people who are close to the seat of power. Because if you are in New York City in 1790, in the winter of 1790, you hear word that what Hamilton's going to do, you can dispatch agents down to the South to get ahead of the spread of the news so you can buy state debts for pennies on the dollar. This happened a lot too, by the way. Members of Congress themselves did this. They immediately suspended business so they could send people out to buy debts for them. So it corrupts members of Congress. The distribution of benefits is maldistributed. It corrupts members of Congress, and it creates a dangerous link between commerce and government, right? Suddenly, the idea here is that the bondholders are going to begin doing the bidding of the United States government. That's a good thing. The problem is that this ends up being a two-way street. The government ends up doing the bidding of the bondholders. Particularly in 1791 and in 1792, a former assistant Treasury Secretary tries to corner the government debt market and creates an economic panic, and Hamilton has to privately give word to people what he thinks the proper level of bank stock is worth. That's a put. In other words, that's Hamilton assuring investors that if it drops below this level, I'm going to come in. So this is an instance of the government becoming not just the wealthy are not just becoming a tool of the government, but the government is becoming a tool of the wealthy. That's what Madison is getting at when he calls it the Praetorian Band. That's a reference to ancient Rome. The Praetorian Band because you were not allowed in ancient Rome to have an army in the capital. And so the emperor was protected by the Praetorian Band. But what happened is a lot of times, a lot of emperors were killed because the Praetorian Band didn't like them, and then they'd pick the new emperor. That's Madison's point here. Madison's argument, and it's a valid one, is that the government is going to become to the financial class what the emperor was to the Praetorian Band. Also, it's of dubious constitutionality. Frankly, Hamilton makes an argument that the bank is justified under the necessary and proper clause. Madison points out that that was not what the necessary and proper clause was intended for. As a matter of fact, we just finished a ratification process where we promised skeptics of the government that this was not a backdoor way to create unlimited power. And here the government is doing something that is specifically not in the Constitution. Not only that, Madison points out that they had actually voted at the Constitutional Convention on a question of whether or not to give the government the power to charter corporations. And the vote failed, right? And another thing is that it establishes a permanent debt. Hamilton does not want to pay off the debt. Okay, Hamilton does not want to pay off the debt. He wants the debt to endure basically for generations. And he has good reasons for that, but Madison's response is that a permanent debt, number one, it burdens the unborn, which is unfair. Jefferson believed that as well. But number two, a permanent debt will become an unlimited field for speculation. A permanent debt will solidify, they argued, the relationship between what Madison and Jefferson called the stock jobbers and the government. Okay. So, like I said, the interesting thing about this, and I find this is where I get a lot of trouble in trying to sort my feelings through about Alexander Hamilton, because when I look at the economic side of the equation, I'm like, wow, yeah. And then I look at the politics and I'm like, no, this is not good. This is not appropriate. The government, a former Treasury official creating an economic panic, and Hamilton responding by giving him a sign of how much he thinks the price should be. This is not what we do in this country. I lived through 2008. My wife was a banker, and it was like, we should be doing these things, right? Right. We talked about this on Monday with George Washington, but Bolingbroke, who was the British, who was a sort of an aristocrat in early 1700s and had warned about the extent to which corruption can undermine free government. Because what happens is members of Parliament, or in this case, members of the House of Representatives, are voting their own pocketbooks rather than the interests of their constituents, right? Madison argued that this is what Hamilton was doing. And actually, he kind of has a point. If you look at the vote on the question of assuming the state debts, it's remarkably close. And the difference was probably members of Congress who were invested in it, but also Madison narrowly defeated it in the spring of 1790. He defeated the Assumption Plan, and the holders in Congress of the public debts basically said, we're not going to agree to paying back the national debt until you give us the assumption of the state debts. Madison saw some really suspicious stuff going on in the second session of the first Congress. And he looked back to Hamilton's comments at the Constitutional Convention where he was praising corruption. Hamilton's kind of okay with this. I mean, the problem for Hamilton at various points is that he ends up kind of having a tiger by the tail, and he can't actually control it, but he thinks he can. He had praised the corruption of the British system at the Constitutional Convention at several points. And so this transitions into the next thing I want to talk about here, which is Hamilton's broader theory of politics. Hamilton's broader theory of politics. I have a feeling, I have not seen the musical, but I'm guessing the musical does not spend a lot of time talking about Hamilton's plan of government that he talks about at the Constitutional Convention, right? Like I said, I'd mentioned this, Hamilton counts himself unfriendly to Republican government. And in the middle of June at the convention, he lays out his own theory, right? He trusts in the genius of the American people, but he does not have much interest in popular sovereignty. He thinks that the people collectively in their judgments are often unwise and that they will needlessly attack, or maybe not needlessly, but counterproductively assault property rights. So his system was one where a Senate and a president are chosen by electoral colleges and they serve for life. So basically an elective king, but we don't get to vote for the king ourselves. Actually, we vote for an electoral college, which votes for another electoral college, which then chooses the president for life. It's very, very, very removed from popular sovereignty. More than that, Hamilton also wants to give this new president and this Senate the power to appoint state governors. So federalism, you can pretty much kiss goodbye as well. This is Hamilton's system, right? So what is his motive here? And I think it's important for us as to understand Hamilton on his own terms. He does have a political theory. What I want to get at here, and I think tomorrow's lecture will really sort of fit in with this, is that if Hamilton really captures the United States as being on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, and Hamilton really understanding and appreciating the importance of property rights in the United States of America, is really Jefferson who captures the rising, frankly, democratic spirit in the United States. And so while Jefferson tomorrow, ironically, Jefferson's economics are going to seem very backwards to us, but his politics are going to seem very, very sensible. So we're going to have almost, I think, the opposite reaction tomorrow. Hamilton is a big believer in a natural aristocracy to guide politics. That's really what he wants to do. This is why Hamilton is comfortable with corruption, because what he wants is his ideal system is to identify the natural elite in society and to elevate them and to give them the power to manage the ship of state for the good of the whole community. And if that requires them to utilize the interests of grubby politicians in the House of Representatives, so be it. That's Hamilton's general view. And if you're wondering, who does Hamilton think of as the natural aristocrat par excellence? It's George Washington. Hamilton was a huge fan. What Hamilton wants to do is give them the freedom to operate, so elevating them and putting themselves outside of electoral politics, and then the power to operate. So weak and indirect ties to the people, as well as the tools of corruption that are used in the British system. And the way I like to analogize this in the book that's on sale out there, The Price of Greatness, the way I like to think about this is it gets down to competing visions of what the government is supposed to do. Madison, in a letter to Washington in 1787 in the spring, says what we really need in government is a neutral umpire, which I think is such a fortunate metaphor for us because it speaks to like baseball, somebody to call the balls and strikes. Right? That was Madison's vision of what the government was supposed to do. It was supposed to do equal justice, not just in the courtroom, but through the political process. Hamilton, I would argue, Hamilton doesn't actually say this, but Hamilton sees government as kind of like a head coach, right? Hamilton is going to put the star players in, and he's going to sit the bad players on the bench. Everybody's going to win at the end, but certain people are going to get extra glory because they're more essential to victory, right? Jefferson's recollection from that dinner might have been embellished. It might have been apocryphal, but I don't think it's incorrect, right? That Hamilton thought that the British system, even with its corruption, was actually very effective. Now, this is one of the reasons why, if you've ever wondered, why is it that so quickly after the Constitution is signed, the two sides who had previously been allies begin to fight so aggressively and even maliciously? This points to the reason. Because the Constitution is still TBD in its substance. These clauses and things, they can mean different things. I mean, some things obviously are locked in. I mean, if Pennsylvania were to send 3 senators to the Senate, but other things, there's a lot of wiggle words in the Constitution, right? What does general welfare mean? What does necessary and proper mean? What does interstate commerce mean? What do these things mean? What sort of government is this going to look like? It might have the form of a Republican government, but is it going to have the substance? And see, what happens is that Jefferson and Madison look at Hamilton's program as he submits it and says, gee whiz, this looks an awful lot like the corrupt British system that was put together 80 years ago. And then Madison shows Jefferson his notes from the debates at the Constitutional Convention, and sweet fancy Moses, there's Alexander Hamilton praising that very system. He's looking to turn this into a monarchy or something, at least, destroying Republican government. That's what they thought. Did Hamilton want to do that? No, I don't think so. Did he have a more high-tone vision for the government? Yes. Did Hamilton want to create ways to insulate the government from the people in ways that we today would take to be contrary to our principles? Yes, he absolutely did. He did intend to give the government a more elitist gloss. And this is what activates the party politics of the 1790s. And this is why the Jeffersonians, by the way, like a lot of times you'll see you'll see like in history textbooks or like sometimes if you're watching documentaries, historians, people will refer to them as the Democratic Republican Party. That is not what they called themselves. They called themselves the Republican Party. And they did so to distinguish themselves from Hamilton. You know, I mentioned, I had a quote up there a moment ago from Jefferson, where he calls Hamilton a colossus of the anti-Republican Party. See, Jefferson and Madison took themselves to be Republicans, in other words, committed to the idea that all authority in government derives from the people. And Hamilton, they argued, was anti-Republican, and the Hamiltonians appropriated the use of the word, the term Federalist. Sorry, normally I'm pretty good at remembering to get my animations in, and this time I forgot. And you might think, well, why are you even doing animations? Having taught high school for so many years, I realized because high schoolers, they don't really care about anything. Well, they do, but you know what? If you have grandkids, you know what I'm talking about. When you have kids, you know what I'm talking about. Right? You put the notes up there, and you give them the entire sheet of notes. And all they're going to start doing is writing it down while you're talking. They're not going to listen to you at all. So I realized that my first year. And so I started putting animations in. So like having things fly in. So it's just a habit I have. So anyway, so this is the origins of party politics. And then things become more paranoid as the decade goes on after the British and the French go to war, because then the Americans have to decide whose side are we going to be on. Now, not taking sides militarily, but who are we rooting for here, right? Choice between the Republican France and the corrupt Britain. That was the Republican way of framing it. The Federalist way was, oh, you mean France where they beheaded the king in a completely lawless fashion and they're now murdering random civilians? That kind of godless anarchy, because that was in the mix as the rhetoric of the time too. Or Great Britain, which is stable and reliable and actually has a system that's lived through the ages. Oh yeah, which one are we going to choose? And what happens as a consequence of this is that you get paranoia. Both sides are already paranoid. It was part of unfortunately, one of the really influential sets of literature, Bolingbroke, I'd mentioned. There were other people like that from British politics who had been very influential in American thinking, and these guys are really paranoid. They're always like these British opposition writers of the early 1700s are always around every dark corner. There's a coup to destroy British liberty, like around every corner. So the Americans, having read all this, are convinced that the threat is always like right around the corner, which is a big reason why that they decided to rebel over what in many respects is pretty trivial, right? You can think of it that way because there's a paranoid style. Richard Hofstadter famously wrote a series of essays on the paranoid style of American politics. There really is something to be said for that. So Washington, and we talked about this on Monday, that Washington is stuck in the middle, and that finally, after 2 terms, Washington has had enough. And a common consensus among historians is that Hamilton goes, this is a technical scholarly term, goes bonkers after Washington leaves. Whether or not that's actually true, like I think maybe it is, but Hamilton does get really conspiratorial and really begins doing some very erratic things, right? He uses his contacts in the Adams cabinet to keep tabs on and influence decisions even after he's retired from the Treasury Department. He sought to sideline Adams twice. I talked about that yesterday. In 1796, he tried to swap a Pinckney in at the last minute for Adams. It didn't work. So in 1800, he tries to swap a Pinckney in for Adams, right? He gets in control of the new army. And it's really sneaky what he does is basically he like jawbones George Washington into like, let me take a step back. So with the war that was percolating potentially with France, we need an army. Well, we need a general. Obviously, it's going to be Washington, but Washington's not going to actually take control of the army unless there's a war. So the second in command becomes very important. Adams does not want Hamilton anywhere near this army, right, for obvious reasons. But Hamilton starts writing letters to Washington, and he gets other people to write letters to Washington and gets Washington to insist to Adams that you have to give me my choice of officers, and I choose Hamilton. Right, so Hamilton gets himself in charge of this army and then begins like scheming out these plans to invade Virginia if the Jeffersonians like rise up against the government. He publicly denounces Adams. And Adams in retirement is a lot of fun because he's just sort of like, I don't care anymore. If you ask me my opinion, I'm going to tell you what I think. And he had all sorts of spicy takes on Alexander Hamilton. He says, this is John Adams, I was president a mere cipher. The government was in the hands of an oligarchy consisting of a triumvirate. And by the way, the triumvirate was McHenry, who was the Secretary of Treasury, Hamilton, and also, in Adams's opinion, Washington. So, right, the mainspring, the prime mover of all this machinery was Alexander Hamilton. If I was weak, as I certainly was, Alexander Hamilton was stark mad. What a great line, right? I mean, Adams, what a guy. So Hamilton ultimately loses his life, as we know, in 1804, and really kind of throws it away in a really ridiculous scenario. The one thing that he does is after the election of 1800, there's a tie in the Electoral College between Jefferson and Jefferson's appointed vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr. And Hamilton is basically says to the Federalists, like, I know it's fun to sort of like slow the wheels, but guys, we cannot have we cannot have Burr as president. Because the Federalists in the House of Representatives had to break the tie for Jefferson, and they hated Jefferson. So there were like 24 votes in the House over the presidential election. And Hamilton finally says, look, Jefferson is a man of principles that I disagree with, but Aaron Burr doesn't have any principles. So, all right. So after the War of 1812, the Jeffersonians embrace Hamilton's economic program. And this is sort of the final portion of my book, The Price of Greatness, about Madison and Hamilton. But what they do, though, is they change its politics. Hamilton's original system was designed to benefit a very narrow slice of the political community. But if you look at what Madison and Henry Clay do after the War of 1812, their vision of the benefits is much broader. So, for instance, they do industrial protection. They don't do Hamilton's plan of basically giving cash bonuses to key industries. They do protection, and in doing industrial protection, you can favor a lot of different economic groups, right? So that, and by the way, for as controversial, I mean, this is sort of an aside, but I know tariffs are very controversial right now, but for most of the period between the War of 1812 and the Great Depression, tariffs were the main source of revenue. It was the main source of economic development, at least it was pitched that way. And for the Republican Party, it was the glue that held that political coalition together. It was how the Republicans, because remember, the Republican Party, the Lincoln Party was the party basically of the North. So how do you keep New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Midwest together? Tariffs. That was one of the ways it was done. It was a political glue because tariffs are effective in that you can tweak the rates to make the woolen industry happy, and you can tweak the rates here to make rope manufacturers happy. You can do all sorts of things, and you can tweak the rates to buy off the sugar industry. They're very useful in that regard. So they were a sort of political glue. And so what we get then is Hamiltonian economics and Madisonian politics, but by the way, still produces corruption, right? The tariff after the Civil War and even before the Civil War was notoriously corrupt. All of Madison's predictions about the first Bank of the United States were not true, but they were true of the second Bank of the United States. That thing was a cesspool of corruption. Hamilton is mostly ignored as a founder until really the late 19th century. It was only people like Henry Cabot Lodge Sr., who wrote a biography of Hamilton in the late 1800s, who began to notice him. Henry Cabot Lodge was a senator from Massachusetts and a friend of Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, not Teddy Kennedy. That would be weird. Teddy Roosevelt, and had realized, Hamilton's actually sort of useful for us, right? The popular reimagining of Hamilton is sort of interesting as a sort of immigrant story. It stands in tension with Hamilton's patent opposition to French immigration during the Adams administration. I think it's great. And look, I think reinventing things and using history for creative purposes is great. I'm not saying like I don't like it, but I'm just saying it's just, it's take, that's for sure. So as I wrap this up here, this, by the way, is the cover of my second book, Republic No More. And big government there is really meant not in sort of like the fight between Republicans and Democrats. It's really more of sort of like, as the government tries to do more and more things, it seems to facilitate corruption. Hamilton, I think, forces us to consider difficult questions between the relationship between power and wealth and idealism and practical politics, right? Can a nation become great, right? Because this is also the subject of the book out there, The Price of Greatness. Can we become a great nation that accomplishes really big, powerful things without privileging the wealthy few? And I'll give you an example of this. Like, for instance, the United States has the best military in the history of the world. But the United States the government is not the one designing the weapons. They're using the private defense contractors to do that, a strategy that I like to call mediation, right? So what happens is that the private interests of defense contractors is entangled for a public purpose, which is a good thing. It facilitates the excellence of our military. But it also means that insofar as the government is looking to seriously reform the Pentagon, they are going to hit a wall with the defense industry and their lobbyists. And this is the case in all sorts of industries. The medical services industry is a great example of this. Before the initiation of Medicare, the medical services industry wanted nothing to do with the government. They warned in the 1960s that Medicare was going to be socialized medicine. And Johnson's response in creating Medicare was to give the medical services industry prices that they couldn't refuse, and they haven't. And as a consequence now, the number 2 donor to American politics is the medical services industry. The number 1 donor is the financial services industry because the United States regulates the banks. And so insofar as the United States is involved in subsidizing or regulating or doing all of these things, it inevitably creates winners and losers. And private interests are going to have an incentive to involve themselves in the government process to make sure that they win. This is exactly what happened with Hamilton and the holders of public debt back in 1790. And it's what happens today. And that's really sort of the subject of my book. And again, you could call it cronyism. Hamilton would say, call it whatever you want. Call it tulips. I don't care. It's necessary. It's essential. Right. And our point in my book that's out for sale out there is he's kind of got a point. Right. Because Madison and the Jeffersonians after the War of 1812 thought we could do the politics of this right. And it still created corruption. Right. To what extent, then, is the actual story of American politics about Hamiltonian corruption? To what extent is that the case? Then Madisonian principle, right? It's a fair question. It's worth asking. It's okay if we admit that, Hamilton is right about the necessity of corruption. Is this just the price of doing business? Is that it? Like you can't get away from it? It is the price of greatness. And so the real question is whether or not corruption has become the point of the whole regime. And so the problem is differences in degree. So like, for instance, we could look at the patronage politics of, say, the 1840s and say, okay, well, that's a little bit of corruption. That's just the price of doing business. But then you look at patronage in the 1880s when James Garfield gets assassinated and you say, okay, this is too much. This has got to stop. Is that the proper question? Is that the way to look at it? See, Hamilton forces us to really begin to consider what Republican politics looks like in practice rather than just in theory, and how sometimes it can be messy. Like I said, this was the subject of my second book, an expansive government. And by the way, I don't mean liberal versus conservative. An expansive government with the power to accomplish great tasks is just going to be one that's subject to capture by the elites. Adams recognized this and he worried about it. We talked about that last night. This is a major anxiety that John Adams had, right? Hamilton was not as worried about it. All right, so final thing here. This is Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention. Like I said, the Jefferson quote might be apocryphal, but it's not wrong. We have been taught to reprobate, or in other words, to despise, the danger of influence in the British government without duly reflecting how far it was necessary to support a good government. Our prevailing passions are ambition and interest, and it will ever be the duty of a wise government to avail itself of those passions in order to make them subservient to the public good, for these ever induce us to action. Is this true? Yeah, it probably is, to be perfectly blunt, right? And what does that mean in practice about Republican government? Government of the people, by the people, for the people. Is it just inevitable that there's going to have at least a tinge of oligarchy in it? Maybe. I don't know. Something to think about for you tonight. Anyway, that's it for me on my presentation. Thank you much for your attention and your time. I've really been enjoying this. Looking forward to tomorrow with Jefferson. It'll be a sort of, we're going to do almost like a 180. So I think you'll really enjoy it. But if you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them now.
It's been speculated that the reason that the naturalized citizens cannot be president was because to keep Hamilton out of the presidency.
I don't think so. Hamilton was, at the time that they decided that, Hamilton was not considered like a threat. And as far as I know, there was not a lot of debate about that. It was just sort of I guess he would not have been eligible either. Yeah, he would not have been. The real problem for Hamilton was that he sent John Jay off to do the Jay Treaty and ruin Jay's reputation, so he couldn't run Jay for president in 1796. See, Jay is sort of like his ace in the hole kind of. He was his hold card, right? Jay was the card to play, but he played it on the question of foreign policy, and so Jay couldn't run for president. So, yeah.
But did Madison ever kind of say, yeah, I didn't agree with the Banks and the Hamiltonian, but in reviewing the past 15 years by the time he's elected, I find that he was right on X and Y and or Z?
Nope. Never gave him credit. Even at the end, said, the difference between Colonel Hamilton and myself is that Colonel Hamilton wished to use the government to do what he wanted it to do, and I wish to do it according to the way it was written, and more importantly, the way it was understood by the ratifying conventions. There are a lot of great qualities to James Madison, but he was never one to admit he was wrong. But no. As a matter of fact, even when he signed into law the Second Bank of the United States, he did not say, I was wrong about it being constitutional in 1791. What he said was, what we have had over the last 20 years or 20-odd years is a debate within the country about the constitutional merits of the bank. And the bank has been judged by the people to be constitutional. And so I will defer to that judgment just as a judge would. Really, really, really sneaky, right? It's not, he doesn't look great on that. I will say, just as you're passing the mic around, that Jefferson really had the advantage of having opposed Hamilton top to bottom from the very beginning and consistently. So he never really owed the late Colonel an apology. Madison probably kind of sort of did, I would say. Yes, sir.
This is a little bit off the main theme of economics, but executive orders. I think it's safe to say that our current president has a slight proclivity to make recourse to executive orders, but it was President Obama, I believe after the 2014 midterms, who made sort of the ultimate quintessential declaration of them when he said, I have a pen and a phone.
Yep.
And I wondered, my sense, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that Hamilton's sense of government, Hamilton would be quite favorable to that. And also, if that in fact is the case, do you think we're moving towards a more Hamiltonian vision of government?
Those are great questions. Now, I'm always hesitant to sort of say what any of the founders would think about any contemporary issue. But I think that, with Hamilton, who argued when the debate over what to do with Britain and France in 1793, they go back to war. And there was a debate in the cabinet over what to do. And Hamilton suggested the president had the power unilaterally to just abrogate the treaty with the French. So Hamilton has a very capacious view of executive power. I think, though, that one of the real problems, and I've been writing about this recently for AEI, is what we have now is a Congress that is broken. We have a Congress that lacks the will to legislate because the partisan divide has become all-consuming, and neither side has the capacity to break the logjam in the Senate, which, by the way, I think is a good thing. I'm in favor of the filibuster. And so what happens then is that presidents feel enormous responsibility to demonstrate to the people that they are solving and addressing public problems. And that pressure creates the incentive for them to become aggressive in their use of executive orders and to take advantage of the ambiguity inherent in congressional legislation and to effectively rewrite it. And both sides are responsible for this, but I do think that what has happened is that increasingly presidents have realized that there is neither political nor legal blowback for them doing so, that Congress is not going to do anything because, frankly, Congress can't do anything. And insofar as the courts do anything, it will be well down the road, so you get the political payoff of at least looking like you're being vigorous. Also, I think presidents have an incentive to demand $1 billion and have the counteroffer be $500 million, and so that they can declare themselves victorious. So Trump is being very bold in his executive orders, thinking that even if 2/3 of these only get through, I will still get a lot. I think that the executive order issue is a reflection ultimately on the incapacity of Congress to govern.
I think I have the microphone now, and I just want to thank you for your wonderful presentations. I do have a question about this so-called corruption. And as people within the government act in their own interests rather than in the popular interest, I want to know whether there's an inclination to keep that going and to increase it. So, or is the process leading to stability where, it's the same thing year after year? Or is the inequality and the pursuit of one's own interest, is that increasing all the time so that the government is becoming less stable and more corrupt?
Those are good questions. Corruption in government has certainly ebbed and flowed, and it's changed its character over generations. And it has been pushed back at various points by reform movements. The greatest sort of public-spirited reform of corruption was the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883, effectively ending patronage on a federal level. I think that what has happened now, now, in fairness, the book that I'm talking about there is from 2015. And after I finished it, I started looking more at history, so I have not been looking as closely at public policy as I used to. But I will say that I do think there is in Washington a consensus among Republicans and Democrats that there are just stakeholders that have to be rewarded, that you have to get them to yes. And so oftentimes that means doing something special for them. I will say that I think that ironically, it is ironic because, again, it's not a left versus right issue. This doesn't really answer your question, but I think it speaks to how tricky the issue is, when we think about, like, one thing that I remember all the way back in 2010 when congressional Republicans took the House, one of the things that John Boehner did was a 5% across the board budget cut to the House staff. And I thought, this is a terrible idea. One of the ways corruption actually functions in Washington, D.C. now is members of Congress have to answer, and they have to have an answer for extremely complex policy questions that are very difficult to answer. And so insofar as congressional staff is, I mean, if you've ever been to Congress, you ever walk around with the staffers, they're all like 20 years old. They're all wearing suits that they got from Kohl's. They're all wearing shoes that their mom bought them. You know, they're all going to be out of there onto something else in like 24 months. That's what congressional staff looks like. And they are not, these staffers do not have the capacity to answer the questions that members of Congress need answered. And so where do they go? They go to interest groups to answer questions. They basically outsource expertise to interest groups. And this is a bipartisan problem, and it's across a range of industries. Probably the most spectacular example of this, the one that I really can't get over, is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is in charge of, and you'll have to forgive me because I don't, at one point I told my students about this back in the spring, and then I lost all the hard data. But the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services is responsible for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. So basically the amount of money that's going out the door is greater than the GDP of like the Netherlands. Like that's how much money is going through this department that only has like 16,000 employees in the whole thing, which is insane, right? 16,000 people to manage like this expenditure of upwards of $1 trillion every year. How are they figuring out the reimbursement rates for doctors and hospitals for Medicare? The answer is that 92% of the time, and this I do remember from my book, 92% of the time they use the suggested reimbursement rate of the medical services industry, which means that the price is supposed to be set by supply and demand, but in effect, the suppliers are exclusively setting the price with the federal government. That's the sort of thing that like that happens everywhere, and it's just sort of taken as how things are done. And I would add to that, one of the problems with this, and I found as I was working on that book, was a very difficult book because every chapter I'd finish a chapter on like farm subsidies, and it was exhausting to like become immersed in farm subsidies. And then I'd start a new chapter on like banking regulations, and it was exhausting, like all of these different industries. And the difficulty is that these policy areas are so complicated that they're basically like these silos that certain people dig all the way down into these silos. But if you're not an expert in the field, you really have no idea exactly what industry groups are doing. I remember there was a story I recounted in this book about somebody, a defense lobbyist, had been asked, like, what's the most important piece of legislation you ever got? You know, and the defense lobbyist said, well, it wasn't really a piece of legislation, but in a subcommittee markup, I managed to get my company's missiles, the price per missile increased to $6 million. Like, how are you going to keep track of that? Like a subcommittee markup hearing? Like the level of what is actually going on is just so granular and so difficult to capture that it's almost overwhelming. I did not start my book with this title. This was the title of the book when I got to the end. Because I started the book with like the Bank of the United States and corruption. I was like, oh, I thought this was fun. And then I did like corruption during the Ulysses S. Grant administration, which was really fun too, because they were all just these sort of smash and grab, bank robbing political machine crooks. They were sort of a lot of fun, actually. And then I got to like the modern era, and it was like, oh. And I remember at the end of this, talking to my wife, like I had to kind of have some sort of concluding section that was like optimistic. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to write. I think I've written myself like you paint yourself into a corner when you're painting your floor or something. I sort of had done that. So it was very difficult. It was a very difficult book to write. I'll say that. So long-winded answer. I don't know if that gets to your question, but so. Yes.
It was always my understanding that Hamilton was the guy who wanted a strong central government and all the states to come together so that we would have one country or one government and the states would be weak. And that Jefferson, just the opposite, and that he kind of won the day in the end because we have, in my opinion, 50 countries in one country. And particularly under certain administrations, those states' rights become more important than what is even going on at the national level. Am I wrong, right? Where is that?
Well, I think that you're right on the difference between Hamilton and Jefferson. And we'll talk a little bit, we'll talk tomorrow about the logic of Jefferson's position. I would make the claim, though, that when we think about the underlying trajectory, I think maybe this sort of like, I think you're onto something that depending on the administration, you can see states being a more defiant or less defiant, things like that. But if you step back and look at the relationship between the federal government and the state governments over the course of the last century, it has been one increasingly of federal dominance. And a big reason for that, frankly, is that the federal government has access to the greatest tax resource in the history of the world, which is the American middle class. And so a lot of times what you see, and a great example of this would be the Affordable Care Act, where the Affordable Care Act offered states an expansion for Medicaid that the states only had to pay a small portion of. And there was enormous ideological opposition from Republican-led states at the outset. But at this point, most states, even those controlled by Republicans, have agreed to it because the federal government, having as much money as it does and able to offer it to states to solve problems for state governments, it's like an offer they can't refuse, right? And what happens as a consequence is that the federal government is able to attach strings to that money. So a great example of that is, I'm sure you all remember back like in the 1980s, everywhere you went, there was a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. And the reason for that was not because all 50 states had agreed to that, but because the federal government had established that as the rule. And if you wanted your federal highway money, you had to abide by the rules. So the federal government is able to do things like that. Now that in turn, though, and I do think this speaks to your observation, which is that the current Supreme Court, this court, and the Rehnquist court before it, has been more inclined to listen to states making 10th Amendment claims. So like, for instance, portions of the Affordable Care Act were struck down by the Roberts Court on federalism claims. So I do think you're onto something there, certainly. But even with that, I think in the grand sweep since the New Deal, we've seen a shift of power from the states to the federal government. You can, yes, sir.
And following up on her question, one of the things you have to look at as far as states' rights is how that term has been abused by the South.
Oh, sure.
Civil War. And that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. No, that's true. And we're not really going to get into it, but there is sort of the issue of, and look, the Constitution, and I think this is just part of it, is the Constitution doesn't have a section that says, here is the precise nature of the relationship between the state governments and the national government. It leaves it to be inferred. And there have been disagreements about that. And you know, the South had an argument in 1860-61 that they were allowed to leave the Union, that was a constitutional act. It wasn't, in my opinion, but it speaks to the reality, which is that the Constitution is, in many respects, just setting up the pieces on the board to be played however people want to play them. So there's a lot of inherent ambiguity and tension within the Constitution on a lot of questions. One of them is federalism.
What would Alexander's opinion be about Trump's to take 15% of NVIDIA's profits for sale for chips to China?
I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, that's sort of the thing. That sort of the thing is that at a certain point, I could give you an answer, but how much of that is me and how much of that is Hamilton? You know, I don't have an opinion. I mean, that's the thing. Like, I've sort of gotten to the point now where I really like to stay in my area of expertise, and I don't. I mean, I could tell you, but just as a guy, I don't really have any special, you know, it seems a little Peronist to me on the one hand, but on the other hand, you know, dealing with China, especially on AI, seems pretty important. So I don't know. I can't decide whether or not I like Alexander Hamilton. I mean, I'm not really, decisiveness is not one of my great qualities, you know? Like, when I was a little kid, I always thought it would be great to be president of the United States, but I realize now I would be a terrible president. So I'd be like, well, yes, we should bomb them. No, wait. No, should we? Oh, I don't know. You know, I just would ask my wife to make a decision for that. She'd make a great president, by the way.
Are there any final questions for Dr. Cost?
You can.
Well, if not, can we have another hand for his wonderful presentation?
Thank you guys.